If she stops breathing, we don't have time to wait. The monitor beeped in sharp, uneven bursts, each sound slicing through the sterile air as Olivia Bennet gripped the edge of the hospital bed, her knuckles turning pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something colder, something emptier, like fear that had nowhere to go, and every breath she took felt too shallow, too late, as if her body had already begun to give up before she allowed it to. She hadn't planned for this night to look like this. Alone, no hand to hold, no voice calling her name, just the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway and the quiet realization that when she signed the admission form with shaking fingers 20 minutes ago, she had left the emergency contact line blank. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass windows of Mercy Hospital, the kind of steady, indifferent rain that didn't care who was inside fighting to stay alive. And Olivia tried to focus on that sound instead of the tightening pressure in her chest, instead of the wave of pain rising again, because focusing on anything else felt easier than remembering how she got here. 6 months ago, she had stood on a crowded sidewalk with a suitcase in one hand and a goodbye she never said sitting heavy in her throat, walking away from a man who had everything except time for her, a man whose name still echoed in quiet moments she tried to bury. Olivia, stay with me. A nurse's voice cut through her thoughts, firm but not unkind, and Olivia blinked, forcing her eyes open as the world swam in and out of focus, the ceiling lights blurring into long streaks above her. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if the motion registered, her body trembling with exhaustion as another contraction surged, stronger this time, pulling a soft gasp from her lips. Somewhere beyond the room, a door opened, and the rhythm of footsteps shifted, more urgent now, more deliberate, and Olivia barely noticed at first, too lost in the haze of pain and fading strength, until a voice, low, controlled, unmistakably familiar, spoke just outside the doorway. What's her status? The words were calm, measured, but they carried something beneath them, something restrained, and the moment Olivia heard it, her breath caught, her fingers tightening against the thin hospital sheet as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the present. No, she thought, not now, not like this, not when she had spent months convincing herself that part of her life was over. The door swung open, and though her vision blurred at the edges, she didn't need to see clearly to know who had just walked into the room, because some people never leave you, no matter how far you run. And as the footsteps drew closer, steady and unhurried, Olivia felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, fear, not of the pain, not of the unknown, but of what it meant to face him again when she had nothing left to hide except the truth he was about to discover. Alexander Reed stopped 2 steps inside the room, the world around him narrowing to a single point as his eyes locked onto her, and for the first time in years, the man who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions felt something slip beyond his control. Olivia lay there, pale against the white sheets, her hair damp against her temples, her breathing uneven, and none of it made sense to him, not the timing, not the silence that had stretched between them for months, not the fact that she had disappeared without a word and now reappeared here, in his hospital, in this condition. Vitals are unstable, the nurse said quickly, pulling him back, but he barely heard it, his gaze still fixed on her as if confirming she was real and not some cruel reconstruction of memory. Olivia forced her eyes open again, and this time she saw him clearly, not as a voice or a shadow but as the man she had once trusted, the man she had left behind, standing there in a crisp white coat that made him look even more distant, even more unreachable than before. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first, only a shallow breath that trembled as it left her, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. You should not be here. The words soft but deliberate, as if pushing him away was the only control she had left. Something flickered across Alexander's expression, not anger, not surprise, but something quieter, heavier, like regret that had been waiting for this moment to surface. I am the one on call, he replied, his tone steady, professional, but there was a tension beneath it, a restraint that did not belong in a clinical setting. Olivia closed her eyes for a brief second, as if gathering strength, as if deciding whether to fight or to surrender to the inevitable, because this was exactly what she had feared, not the pain, not the uncertainty, but facing him when she could no longer hide the truth. Another wave of pressure tightened through her, pulling a sharp breath from her chest, and the monitor beside her reacted instantly, its rhythm quickening, uneven, urgent. We need to move, the nurse said, glancing between them, unaware of the history that charged the air, and Alexander stepped forward at last, closing the distance that had once felt impossible to cross, his movements precise, controlled, but his eyes never left Olivia's face. He saw the exhaustion there, the strain, the quiet determination that had always defined her, and beneath it, something else. Something he had not expected, something that unsettled him more than the situation itself. "How far along?" he asked, directing the question to the nurse, but Olivia answered instead, her voice steadier now despite everything. 36 weeks, and the number landed heavier than it should have, because his mind moved faster than logic, faster than reason, calculating, aligning timelines he had not allowed himself to consider before. 36 weeks meant she had been carrying this child. Long before she walked away, long before that final night when everything between them had broken without explanation. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained even when he spoke again. "We are going to take care of you," and it was a statement, not a question, not a request, something absolute in a moment where nothing else felt certain. Olivia let out a faint, almost humorless breath, her gaze drifting away from him toward the ceiling lights, because she knew what he was beginning to understand, and she knew there was no way to stop it now. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass, indifferent to the shift inside the room, where the past was no longer something either of them could avoid, and as the team prepared to move her, Olivia felt the fragile line between truth and silence begin to break, one heartbeat at a time. The wheels of the hospital bed rattled softly as they moved her down the hallway, the ceiling lights passing above in a slow, endless line, each one blurring into the next, and Olivia focused on that rhythm because it was easier than focusing on him walking beside her, matching every turn, every stop, every decision without hesitation. Alexander kept his hands steady at his sides, giving instructions in a calm, measured tone that the staff followed without question, yet inside, nothing felt steady, nothing felt controlled, because every detail he had just learned refused to stay quiet, repeating itself in his mind with unsettling clarity. 36 weeks, he thought again, and the number did not change no matter how many times he ran through it, no matter how much he tried to find another explanation that would make this moment simpler, cleaner, less personal. "We are prepping for an emergency delivery," a nurse called ahead as the doors to the operating area opened, and the air shifted, cooler, sharper, filled with the quiet urgency of a place where seconds mattered. Olivia's fingers tightened slightly against the thin blanket, and for a moment, she turned her head just enough to look at him again, really look this time, and what she saw was not just the composed professional the world knew, but something beneath it, something unguarded, something searching for answers he had not yet asked. "You should let someone else handle this," she said, her voice fragile but firm. The effort it took to speak clear in the way her chest rose and fell unevenly. Alexander did not look away from her, did not break the steady rhythm of his steps as he responded, "There is no one more qualified here tonight," and the words were true, but they were not the whole truth, not even close. Olivia let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting back to the ceiling as another wave of pressure moved through her, and she closed her eyes briefly, not in surrender, but in acceptance, because she knew that convincing him to step away had never been something she could do, not before, not now. The doors closed behind them with a soft finality, sealing them into a space where the outside world no longer existed, where only decisions and consequences remained. "Blood pressure is dropping," someone said, and the tone shifted again, tighter now, more urgent, and Alexander stepped forward without hesitation, his focus narrowing, every movement precise, every instruction clear, yet beneath it all, the questions pressed harder, louder, impossible to ignore any longer. He glanced at the chart in his hand, then back at Olivia, and for the first time, his voice lowered, just enough that only she could hear. "Why did you not tell me?" It was not an accusation, not even fully a question, more like something that had been waiting to be said long before this night. Olivia opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze with a quiet steadiness that surprised even herself, because she had imagined this moment so many times, imagined anger, imagined distance, imagined anything but this fragile honesty between them. "Because you would have tried to fix it," she answered softly, each word measured, deliberate. "And some things are not meant to be fixed, Alexander." His name lingered in the air between them, heavier than anything else that had been said. For a brief second, something shifted in him, something that did not belong to the man who solved problems for a living, who turned chaos into strategy, who controlled outcomes with precision, and in that second, he realized that this was not something he could calculate, not something he could control, because this was not a deal, not a decision, not a risk to be managed, this was a life that had moved forward without him, a truth that existed whether he accepted it or not. "We are ready," a nurse interrupted, pulling him back into the moment, and Alexander straightened slightly, the weight of everything settling into something quieter but no less intense, because whatever answers he needed would have to wait, and whatever this child meant, whatever Olivia meant, none of it mattered more than what came next. He stepped into position, his voice steady once more, but his eyes lingered on her for just a second longer, as if memorizing something he had once taken for granted, and in that fleeting moment, the man who had always been in control understood something simple and unshakable, that this night was not about power, not about wealth, not about who he used to be, but about whether he could hold on to what he had already lost once before. The room settled into a focused stillness, the kind that carried weight rather than silence, where every movement had purpose and every second stretched just enough to remind everyone inside that timing was everything, and Alexander stood at the center of it, his hands steady, his voice calm, guiding each step with practiced precision, yet beneath that surface, something unfamiliar pressed against his composure, something that did not belong in a place defined by control. Olivia felt it too, not in the way the monitors tracked her body or the staff moved around her, but in the way the air seemed to shift whenever he spoke, in the quiet certainty that no matter how much time had passed, he was still the one person who could make everything feel both safer and more uncertain at the same time. "Stay with me," he said quietly, not as a command, but as something closer to a promise, and Olivia focused on his voice, anchoring herself to it as the world around her blurred again, the lights overhead fading into soft halos, the sounds blending into a distant rhythm that felt harder to follow. With each passing moment, she had told herself she was ready for this, ready to do it alone, ready to face whatever came without looking back, but now, with him standing there, that resolve felt thinner, more fragile, because some part of her had never really let go of what they once had, even when she had walked away. "Heart rate is unstable," a nurse said, her tone controlled but edged with urgency, and Alexander nodded once, already adjusting, already moving forward without hesitation. Because this was the part he understood, the part he had trained for, the part where outcomes depended on decisions made in seconds rather than months. But even as he worked, his mind refused to stay confined to the present, drifting instead to a memory he had not allowed himself to revisit until now, a quiet evening 6 months ago when Olivia had stood by the window of his penthouse, looking out at a city that never slowed down, her expression distant in a way he had noticed but not questioned. Not then, not when everything else had seemed more important. "Do you ever feel like something is missing?" she had asked that night, her voice soft, almost lost in the background noise of traffic below, and he had answered without thinking, without really listening, "We have everything we need." And now, standing here, watching her fight to hold on, he understood what she had been asking, understood what he had failed to see. "Alexander," a nurse's voice cut through his thoughts, sharper now, pulling him back with urgency that left no room for distraction, and he stepped forward, his focus narrowing again, his movements precise, because whatever he had missed before, whatever he had lost, he was not going to lose this moment too. Olivia's hand shifted slightly against the sheet, her fingers curling weakly as if searching for something, and before he could think about it, before he could question whether it was appropriate or necessary, Alexander reached out and took her hand in his, the contact brief but undeniable, a quiet connection in a room filled with controlled chaos. Her eyes opened just enough to meet his, and for a second, everything else seemed to fall away, the monitors, the voices, the pressure of the moment, leaving only the truth neither of them had spoken out loud. "Do not let go," she whispered, the words barely there, but they carried more weight than anything else in the room, and Alexander tightened his hold just slightly, not enough to interfere, not enough to distract, but enough to answer her without words, enough to promise something he could not measure or guarantee. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent, but inside, something had shifted, something deeper than circumstance, deeper than timing, and as the pressure of the moment built toward its breaking point, Alexander realized that this was no longer just about saving a life, it was about facing the one truth he could no longer avoid, that some things were never meant to be controlled, only chosen, and this time, he was not going to choose wrong. The steady rhythm of the monitors shifted again, not louder but sharper, like a warning that could no longer be ignored. And the room responded instantly, every movement tightening with urgency as if the air itself had grown thinner. Alexander's focus sharpened to a single point, every distraction falling away as instinct and training took over, yet beneath that precision, something deeper held firm, something personal that refused to step aside. "We need to move now," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that left no room for hesitation, and the team responded without question, adjusting, preparing, aligning around his direction with seamless coordination. Olivia felt the shift before she fully understood it, the subtle change in tone, the way the voices around her lost their softness and became something more deliberate, more immediate, and her fingers tightened instinctively, searching again, finding his hand still there, still steady, still present in a way she had not allowed herself to expect. "I am right here," Alexander said quietly, not looking away from her, not breaking the connection even as everything else demanded his attention, and for a moment, that was enough to ground her, enough to quiet the fear pressing at the edges of her thoughts. But the moment did not last, because nothing about this night was meant to be easy, and the numbers on the screen told a story he could not ignore, one that required a decision no protocol could fully guide. "We have limited time," a nurse said, her voice controlled but edged with concern, and Alexander nodded once, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he weighed what came next, not as a businessman calculating risk, but as a man standing at the edge of something he could not undo. He had spent years building a world where outcomes could be predicted, where every variable could be accounted for, but here, in this room, with Olivia lying in front of him and a life waiting to enter the world, none of those rules applied. He stepped closer, his voice lowering again, meant only for her. "Listen to me," and Olivia turned her head slightly, her eyes opening just enough to meet his, even through the haze, even through the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. "If things become complicated," he continued, each word deliberate, steady, "I need you to trust me," and there was something in the way he said it, not authority, not control, but something quieter, something that felt like a promise rather than a command. Olivia studied his face for a brief second, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that might tell her he was not certain, but she found none, only that same unshakable steadiness that had once made her believe he could handle anything, even when she could not. "I do not have a choice, do I?" she whispered, a faint, almost tired trace of a smile touching her lips, and Alexander's expression softened just slightly, enough to answer her without words. The room moved faster now, voices overlapping in controlled urgency, instruments prepared, decisions made in seconds that would echo far beyond this night, and through it all, Alexander remained exactly where he needed to be, not stepping back, not handing control to anyone else, because walking away was no longer an option he could accept. He reached for the consent form placed beside him, the lines of text clear, direct, outlining risks that could not be softened or ignored, and for a brief second, his hand paused above it, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what it represented. Then, without hesitation, he signed, his name steady, final, committing himself not just to the procedure, but to everything that came with it, everything that could not be reversed. Olivia watched him through half-closed eyes, and though she could not read every word, she understood the meaning behind the gesture, understood that whatever happened next, he had chosen to stay, to take responsibility in a way he had not before, and something inside her eased, just enough to let go of the last thread of resistance she had been holding on to. Outside, the rain had begun to slow, its steady rhythm softening against the glass, and inside, as the moment reached its peak, as everything balanced on a line too thin to see, Alexander realized that this was not about saving a situation, not about correcting a past mistake, but about standing in a moment where nothing was guaranteed and choosing, without hesitation, to give everything he had to protect what mattered most. The pen was barely set aside when everything accelerated, not in chaos but in a controlled surge of urgency that filled the room with purpose, and Alexander stepped fully into it, his voice firm, clear, guiding every movement as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, yet nothing about this felt routine, nothing about this felt distant anymore. "Stay with me, Olivia," he said again. Quieter this time, closer, as if the words were meant to anchor her to something beyond the sterile walls, beyond the cold precision of the room, and Olivia held on to that voice the way someone holds on to the last steady thing in a shifting world, her breath shallow but determined, her focus narrowing to the sound of him, the lights above seemed brighter now, sharper, the edges of everything more defined as the moment pushed forward, and though her strength felt like it was slipping, she refused to let go completely, not yet, not when there was still something left to hold on to. "We are almost there," a nurse said, her tone encouraging, steady, and Alexander nodded, his attention never leaving Olivia for more than a second at a time, balancing the technical with the personal in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost fragile, because this was not just another case. Not just another outcome to manage. A sudden shift in the monitor pulled his focus, the rhythm faltering just enough to demand immediate attention, and the room responded instantly, every movement tightening again, every voice lowering into concentrated urgency. "We need to adjust," someone said, and Alexander stepped in without hesitation, his hands steady, his mind clear despite the pressure building beneath the surface, because this was where everything came down to instinct, to experience, to the ability to act without doubt. Olivia felt the change, the subtle shift that told her something was not going as smoothly as it should, and for a brief moment, fear broke through the exhaustion, sharp and undeniable, but before it could take hold, she heard him again, closer now, steadier than everything else. "Look at me," and she did, her eyes finding his even as the world blurred at the edges. "You are stronger than this moment," he said, not as reassurance, but as truth, something he believed without question, and for a second, that belief felt like something she could borrow, something she could use to keep going. The room moved faster again, but not out of control, never out of control, because Alexander refused to let it reach that point, his presence holding everything in place even as the situation pressed harder, demanding more, testing every limit. Time stretched and compressed all at once, seconds feeling longer and shorter at the same time, and then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, something shifted, the tension in the room easing just enough to be noticed, the rhythm on the monitor finding a steadier pace, not perfect, but better, enough to signal that they were moving in the right direction. Alexander did not relax, did not step back, but there was a subtle change in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement that they had crossed the most fragile edge. That the outcome was no longer slipping away but moving towards something real, something possible. Olivia felt it too, not in numbers or sounds, but in the way the pressure began to change, in the way her body responded, not giving up but pushing forward, and through the haze, through the exhaustion that still threatened to pull her under, she held on to one clear thought, one steady truth, that she was not alone in this moment, not anymore. Alexander remained exactly where he was, his focus unwavering, his voice guiding the final steps with the same calm precision, but inside, something had already shifted, something that would not return to what it was before, because this was no longer just about getting through the night, no longer just about doing his job. This was about the life that was about to enter the world, and the realization that some decisions did not end when the moment passed, they stayed, shaping everything that came after. And as the room moved toward that final turning point, Alexander understood that whatever happened next, there was no version of his life where he could walk away from this again. For a moment, everything held its breath, as if the room itself was waiting for something unseen to arrive, and then it came, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, a soft, fragile sound that cut through the controlled silence like light breaking through a storm. And every movement in the room shifted at once, tension giving way to something quieter, something almost sacred. Olivia did not understand it at first, her senses dulled by exhaustion, her body heavy, but she felt the change, the way the air seemed to soften, the way the urgency around her transformed into something steadier, something calmer, and her eyes fluttered open just enough to search for him. Alexander had already turned, his focus drawn to the small, careful movements happening just beyond his immediate reach, and for the first time that night, the precision in his posture gave way to something else, something deeply human, as he listened, truly listened, to that new sound filling the room. "The baby is here," a nurse said, her voice warm now, carrying a note of relief that had not been there before, and the words settled into the space like a quiet confirmation that the moment they had been working toward had finally arrived. Olivia let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her fingers loosening against the sheet as the weight of everything began to shift, not disappearing, but changing, becoming something she could carry. "Is the baby okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, but Alexander heard it. Of course he did, and he stepped closer again, his expression softer now, the sharp edges of focus replaced by something deeper, something steadier. the baby is strong, he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no distance, just certainty, and Olivia closed her eyes for a brief second, letting those words settle, letting them become real. Across the room, the nurse carefully wrapped the newborn, small movements precise and gentle, and for a second, Alexander remained where he was, caught between two worlds, the one he had always known and the one that had just begun without his permission, without his preparation, yet undeniably his. His mind moved quickly, not with calculation, but with realization, because there was no avoiding it now, no delaying the truth that had been building since the moment he walked into the room, the timelines, the silence, the unanswered questions all converging into something simple and undeniable. He stepped forward slowly, as if crossing an invisible line, and when the nurse turned slightly, offering a clearer view, Alexander saw the child for the first time, not as an idea, not as a possibility, but as something real. Something that existed beyond theory or doubt, and in that moment, something inside him shifted completely, something he could not define in numbers or decisions. Olivia watched him through half-open eyes, reading the change in him without needing words, because she had seen him in every version before, controlled, distant, certain, and this was none of those things. This was something quieter, something uncertain but honest. "You can come closer," the nurse said gently, and Alexander did, his steps measured but drawn by something stronger than logic, and as he stood there, looking down at the small, fragile life that had just entered the world, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, something that did not ask for control or permission, something that simply existed. He reached out slightly, not touching yet, just close enough to feel the presence, and his voice, when it came, was lower than before. Almost unrecognizable in its softness. "Hello." It was a simple word, but it carried everything he could not yet say. Olivia's gaze followed him, her breathing steadier now, her strength slowly returning in quiet increments, and for the first time since the night began, she allowed herself to let go of the fear she had been holding on to, because whatever came next, whatever questions remained, this moment was real, this life was real, and she was not facing it alone anymore. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, the soft tapping fading into silence, and inside, as the room settled into a new rhythm, Alexander realized that everything he had built, everything he had believed mattered, had just been redefined in a single moment, not by power, not by success, but by the quiet, undeniable presence of a life that had changed his forever. The room gradually exhaled. The urgency that had once filled every corner now replaced with a quieter rhythm, softer voices, slower movements, and the steady reassurance that the hardest part had passed. But for Alexander, nothing felt lighter, nothing felt finished, because the moment he had just stepped into was only beginning to unfold. He stood there for a second longer than necessary, his eyes still on the small bundle in the nurse's arms, as if trying to memorize something he did not yet fully understand, something that felt both fragile and permanent at the same time. "Would you like to hold the baby?" the nurse asked gently, her voice careful, respectful, and for the first time that night, Alexander hesitated, not because he did not want to, but because he suddenly realized how unprepared he was for something so simple, something so human, something that did not follow rules or respond to control. He nodded slowly, almost instinctively, and stepped forward, his movements more cautious now, more deliberate than they had been all night, as if he were approaching something that required more than skill, more than knowledge. The nurse guided him without words, placing the baby carefully into his arms, and the moment the weight settled there, light but undeniable, something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, beyond logic, beyond thought, something that could not be explained or managed. He looked down, really looked, taking in the small features, the quiet movement, the simple existence of a life that had just entered the world. Without asking for permission, without waiting for the right time, and for the first time in years, Alexander Reed did not think about what came next. He did not calculate outcomes or risks. He simply stood there, present in a moment that required nothing but his attention. Across the room, Olivia watched him, her strength slowly returning, her breathing steadier now. And what she saw in his expression was something she had never seen before, not in the months they had been together, not in the years she had known him, a kind of quiet vulnerability that stripped away everything else, leaving only something real, something unguarded. "You do not have to stay," she said softly, the words carrying no bitterness, no accusation, only a quiet acknowledgement of the past, of the choices they had both made, and Alexander looked up at her then, his gaze steady but changed, as if the question itself no longer made sense. "I am not going anywhere," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no calculation behind the words, just certainty, something simple and absolute that did not need to be explained. Olivia held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for doubt, for the version of him she had once known, but it was not there, replaced by something steadier, something that did not promise perfection, but did promise presence, and for the first time since she had walked away, she allowed herself to believe it. The nurse adjusted the blanket slightly, ensuring the baby was comfortable, and stepped back, giving them space, understanding without needing to be told that this moment belonged to them now, not to the room, not to the procedure, but to something quieter, something more personal. Alexander shifted his hold slightly, instinctively, careful not to disturb the fragile balance, and as he did, he felt a strange sense of clarity settle in, not the kind that came from planning or decision-making, but the kind that came from simply knowing that whatever he had been before, whatever he had prioritized, it no longer held the same weight. "What is the baby's name?" he asked after a moment, his voice softer now, almost hesitant, and Olivia looked at him, a faint, tired smile touching her lips as she answered, "I was waiting to decide," and the words carried more meaning than they seemed, because for the first time, the decision did not feel like it belonged to her alone. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the world quiet and still, and inside, as the soft hum of the hospital continued around them, Alexander understood something he had never allowed himself to consider before, that sometimes the most important moments in life did not come with preparation or control. They arrived unannounced, changed everything, and asked only one thing in return, that you stay. The quiet in the room did not feel empty, it felt full, as if something important had settled into place without needing to announce itself, and Alexander remained standing there, the newborn resting carefully in his arms, his gaze steady but thoughtful, as if he were still catching up to a reality that had arrived faster than he could prepare for. The small movements in his arms drew his attention again, subtle shifts, soft breaths, the kind of presence that did not demand anything yet changed everything. And for a moment, he simply watched, allowing himself to exist in that space without trying to define it. Across from him, Olivia adjusted slightly against the pillows, her strength returning in quiet increments, her eyes clearer now, and as she looked at him holding the child, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel before, not hope exactly, but something close to it, something that carried possibility without promise. "You look like you are trying to understand something that cannot be explained," she said softly, her voice still gentle but steadier than before, and Alexander let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement rather than a response. "I am," he admitted, his eyes still on the baby. "I have spent most of my life believing that everything could be predicted if you had enough information." He paused slightly, shifting his hold instinctively as the baby moved. "But this does not fit into anything I know." Olivia watched him carefully, hearing the honesty in his voice, the absence of control that had once defined him, and it made something in her chest ease just a little more. "Not everything is meant to be planned," she replied, her gaze softening as she looked at the child. "Some things just happen, and you decide what to do after." The words lingered between them, simple but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Alexander nodded slowly, not because he fully understood, but because for once, he was willing to accept something without needing to control it, and that alone felt like a shift he could not ignore. A nurse stepped quietly back into the room, checking on Olivia with a gentle efficiency, her movements calm now that the urgency had passed, and she glanced at Alexander with a small, knowing smile, as if recognizing the significance of what she was witnessing without needing to say it out loud. "We will be moving her to recovery soon," she said softly, and Alexander acknowledged her with a brief nod, though his attention remained divided, anchored both to the child in his arms and the woman watching him across the room. Olivia took a slow breath, letting the word settle, because recovery meant the next step, meant facing what came after this moment, and for the first time, that future did not feel as uncertain as it had before. "You should go," she said again, not as a dismissal, but as a test, a quiet measure of whether the man in front of her was still the one she had known, or someone different entirely. Alexander looked up at her, meeting her gaze directly this time, and there was no hesitation, no calculation in his expression, only clarity. "I told you, I am not going anywhere," he repeated, And the simplicity of the words carried more weight than any promise he could have made before. Olivia held his gaze, searching for something to contradict him. Something to protect herself from believing too much, but she found none, only that same steady presence that had replaced the distance she once knew. The baby shifted again, a soft sound escaping, and Alexander instinctively adjusted his hold, a small, natural movement that felt unfamiliar and yet completely right at the same time, and as he did, he realized something else, something that settled deeper than the moment itself. That staying was not just a decision he was making for now, it was something that would extend beyond this room, beyond this night, into a future he had not planned but was no longer willing to ignore. Outside, the first light of early morning began to break through the clouds, faint but steady, and inside, as the room prepared for the next transition, something unspoken but undeniable had already taken shape, not as a resolution, not as a perfect ending, but as a beginning neither of them had expected, yet neither of them could walk away from any more. The hallway outside the recovery unit was quieter, the urgency of the night fading into the low hum of early morning routines, and Alexander walked beside the moving bed as Olivia was carefully guided into her new room, his step steady, unhurried, as if leaving even for a second was no longer something he allowed himself to consider. The baby had been placed in a small bassinet beside her, wrapped securely, peaceful in a way that felt almost surreal after everything that had just happened, and for a moment, Alexander found himself watching that stillness, trying to reconcile it with the intensity that had brought them here. Olivia shifted slightly as the nurses adjusted her position, her movements slow but stronger now, and when the room settled again, when the last set of instructions had been given and the door closed softly behind them, a different kind of silence took over, one that did not belong to strangers or procedures, but to something more personal, something that required no audience. "You really stayed," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but no longer fragile, and Alexander looked at her, the question in her tone not one of doubt, but of recognition, as if she was still adjusting to a version of him she had not expected to see again. "I told you I would," he replied simply, moving closer to the bassinet, his gaze softening as he looked down at the child again, and this time, the moment did not feel unfamiliar, it felt steady, as if something inside him had already begun to settle into place. Olivia watched him carefully, her thoughts slower now, clearer, and for the first time since she had left, she allowed herself to revisit the question she had avoided for months, not what had happened between them, but what could happen now. "You could still walk away," she said, not as a challenge, but as a truth she needed to acknowledge, because she had learned not to expect permanence, not to rely on promises that could change with time. Alexander did not answer immediately, his attention still on the baby, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he was choosing his words carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight they carried. "I could," he admitted finally, his voice calm, steady, "but that would mean ignoring something that I cannot ignore anymore." He paused slightly, then looked back at her, meeting her gaze with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "And I have spent enough time doing that." Olivia held his gaze, searching for distance, for the version of him who had once prioritized everything else over what stood in front of him, but she did not find it, only a quiet certainty that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely reassuring. The baby stirred softly, a small movement that drew both their attention at the same time, and Alexander instinctively reached out, adjusting the blanket with a gentle care that did not need to be learned, only accepted, and as he did, he felt that same shift again, deeper now, more grounded, as if each small action was building something real, something lasting. "You do not even know if it is yours," Olivia said softly, the words not meant to create distance, but to bring clarity, to place the truth between them where it could not be avoided, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold still again, waiting for his response. Alexander looked down at the child, then back at her, and there was no hesitation, no calculation, only a quiet understanding that had already taken shape within him. "I do not need a test to tell me what I am already willing to be responsible for," he said, his voice low but unwavering, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than certainty ever could. Olivia felt something shift inside her at those words, something she had protected carefully, something she had kept guarded for months, and for the first time, she allowed that guard to lower just slightly, not fully, not yet, but enough to let something new take its place. Outside the window, the sky had begun to lighten, the first traces of sunrise breaking through The fading night, and inside, as the quiet of the room settled around them, the distance that had once defined their story no longer felt as fixed as it had before, replaced instead by something uncertain but possible, something that did not demand perfection, only presence, and as Alexander remained there, not stepping back, not turning away, it became clear that this was no longer about what had happened in the past, but about what they were choosing now, moment by moment, without guarantees, but with something stronger than certainty, the willingness to stay. The morning light continued to grow stronger, soft rays slipping through the window and stretching across the quiet room, touching the edges of everything with a gentle clarity that felt almost symbolic, as if the night had truly ended and something new had begun. And Olivia lay still for a moment, watching that light before letting her gaze drift back to him. Alexander had not moved far, still standing near the bassinet, his posture relaxed in a way that would have seemed unfamiliar to anyone who knew him outside this room, because there was no urgency in him now, no pressure to leave, no distraction pulling his attention elsewhere, only a quiet presence that remained steady, grounded in something he had not allowed himself to feel before. "You always hated mornings," Olivia said softly, a faint hint of something lighter in her voice, something that had not been there before, and Alexander glanced toward her, a subtle shift in his expression as he recognized the memory behind her words. "I hated rushed mornings," he corrected gently, his tone carrying a trace of warmth that had been absent for a long time. The kind where everything felt like it was already too late before the day even started. Olivia watched him as he spoke, noticing the difference, not just in his words, but in the way he said them, slower, more deliberate, as if he was no longer trying to stay ahead of time, but instead learning to stay within it. "And this one?" she asked quietly, her eyes moving briefly toward the baby before returning to him. "Does it feel rushed?" Alexander followed her gaze, his expression softening again as he looked at the small figure resting peacefully, and he shook his head slightly. "No," he said, his voice low but certain, "this one feels exactly like it is supposed to." The words settled into the room, simple but carrying a weight that neither of them needed to question. Olivia let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing just a little more, because for the first time, she felt something she had not expected to feel again, a sense of calm that did not come from certainty, but from the absence of fear. "I used to wait for you," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, reflective. "Back then, I thought if I just waited long enough, you would choose something different." The confession was not bitter, not accusatory, just honest, a piece of truth she had carried quietly for too long. Alexander did not look away, did not try to interrupt or explain, because he understood that this was not a moment for defense, but for listening. "And I did not," he said finally, his voice steady but lower, the weight of the admission clear in the way he held it, not avoiding it, not softening it, just accepting it for what it was. Olivia nodded slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window again as the light continued to grow. "So I stopped waiting," she added, the words simple but final, marking a line between who she had been and who she had become. For a moment, the room held that truth quietly, not heavy, but present. Something that needed to exist before anything else could move forward. Alexander took a small step closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to show that he was not standing apart anymore, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that had not been there before, not certainty, not promises, but intention. "I am not asking you to wait," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that felt different from anything in the past. "I am asking you to let me stay." Olivia looked at him, really looked this time, searching not for perfection, not for guarantees, but for consistency, for something that would remain even when the moment changed. And what she saw was not the man who had once walked away from choices that mattered, but someone who understood the weight of staying, someone who was no longer trying to control the outcome, but willing to be part of it. The baby stirred softly again, a quiet reminder of everything that had shifted between them, and Olivia's gaze softened as she looked at the small life beside her, then back at Alexander, because whatever came next, whatever decisions they would have to face, this moment was no longer about what they had lost, but about what they were choosing to build, one step at a time, without rushing, without forcing, just staying present in something that felt real enough to begin again. The light in the room had fully shifted now, no longer soft and uncertain but clear, steady, filling every corner with a quiet brightness that made everything feel more real, more defined. And Olivia sat up slightly with the nurse's help, her movements careful but stronger than before, her body no longer fighting the night but recovering from it, and as she settled back against the pillows, her eyes moved instinctively to the bassinet, drawn by the simple, undeniable presence that had changed everything. Alexander noticed the shift immediately, the way her attention centered not on him, not on the past, but on the child beside her, and for a moment, he stepped back, not in distance but in understanding, recognizing that this was her space, her moment, something he was now part of but not the center of. "Do you want to hold the baby?" he asked. Quietly, his voice carrying none of the authority it once did, only an offer, a willingness to follow rather than lead, and Olivia looked at him, a small, genuine smile forming despite the exhaustion that still lingered in her expression. "I have been waiting for that," she said softly, and the words carried a warmth that reached him in a way he had not expected. The nurse stepped in again, carefully lifting the baby and placing the small bundle into Olivia's arms, guiding her gently, making sure she was comfortable. And as the weight settled there, Olivia's entire posture changed, her shoulders softening, her gaze steadying in a way that spoke of something deeper than relief, something instinctive, immediate, undeniable. She looked down, her expression quiet but full, taking in every detail as if committing it to memory, and for a moment, nothing else in the room mattered. Alexander watched from where he stood, not interrupting, not stepping forward, simply observing the connection forming in front of him. Something that did not need explanation or validation, something that existed beyond words, and in that stillness, he felt a sense of clarity that had been building slowly since the moment he walked into the hospital, now settling into something he could no longer question. "She is beautiful," he said after a moment, his voice softer than it had ever been, and Olivia glanced up at him briefly before returning her gaze to the baby. She repeated, as if tasting the word, letting it settle into reality. And then she nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful. "I had a feeling." The admission was simple, but it carried a quiet intimacy, a glimpse into the months she had spent preparing for this moment alone. Alexander stepped a little closer, not intruding, but no longer holding himself apart, and his eyes moved between Olivia and the child, the two realities now intertwined in a way that could not be separated. "Have you thought of a name?" he asked gently, remembering her earlier words, and Olivia let out a slow breath, her gaze softening again as she considered it, no longer as a decision she had to make alone, but as something shared. "I used to think I would choose something strong," she said quietly, "something that meant she could stand on her own no matter what." She paused, her fingers adjusting the blanket slightly, a small, protective gesture that felt instinctive. "But now," she continued, lifting her eyes to meet his, "I think I want something that reminds her she does not have to do everything alone." The words hung in the air between them, not just about the child, but about everything that had brought them here. Alexander held her gaze, understanding more in that moment than anything that had been said directly, and he nodded slowly, not offering suggestions, not trying to shape the choice, but simply being present in it, because for the first time, he understood that not every decision needed to be led, some only needed to be shared. The baby stirred gently in Olivia's arms, a small movement that drew both of their attention again, and as Olivia adjusted her hold, her expression softened even further, something quiet and certain settling into place within her, while Alexander stood beside her, no longer questioning where he belonged, no longer calculating his place in the moment, because the answer had already been given in everything that had happened. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, the sky clear now, the rain completely gone, and inside, as the room filled with a calm that felt earned rather than given, it became clear that this was no longer just the end of a long night, but the beginning of something neither of them had planned, yet both of them were now choosing, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, step by step. Together, the room had settled into a quiet rhythm that no longer felt temporary, no longer tied to the urgency of the night but anchored in something steadier, something that carried forward into what came next. And Olivia remained still, the baby resting gently in her arms, her gaze calm, thoughtful, as if she was no longer just reacting to what had happened but beginning to understand what it meant. Alexander stood beside her, not distant, not uncertain, but present in a way that required no explanation, his attention shifting naturally between them, no longer divided but shared, as if the space between them had been replaced by something simpler, something more honest. "I think I have a name," Olivia said after a moment, her voice soft but certain, and Alexander looked at her, not with expectation, but with quiet attentiveness, ready to listen rather than decide. Grace. She continued, her eyes moving back to the baby as she spoke the word, letting it settle, letting it become real, because she came into the world in a moment that could have gone differently, but did not. She paused slightly, her expression softening even more, and because sometimes what we need most is not control, it is grace. The word lingered in the room, simple and gentle, yet carrying something deeper, something that reached beyond the moment itself, and Alexander nodded slowly, not because it was the perfect name, but because it was the right one, because it reflected something he had only just begun to understand. Grace, he repeated quietly, as if committing it to memory, and the way he said it carried a weight that went beyond acknowledgement, something closer to acceptance. The baby shifted slightly, a soft movement that seemed almost responsive, and Olivia smiled faintly, her fingers adjusting the blanket with a care that felt instinctive, natural, something she no longer questioned. It fits, Alexander added after a moment, his voice steady, and Olivia glanced at him briefly, a small, knowing look passing between them, because the name did not just belong to the child, it belonged to the moment, to everything that had changed without warning, without preparation. Outside the window, the morning had fully taken hold, the sky clear, the light steady, no trace of the storm that had filled the night before, and inside, that same shift had taken place, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to be real. What happens now? Olivia asked quietly, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with an openness that had not been there before, and Alexander took a small breath, not because he did not know the answer, but because for the first time, he understood that the answer did not need to be fully formed. Now, he said, his voice calm, grounded, we take it one step at a time. He paused slightly, his gaze steady on hers. Together, if you will let me. The words were not a promise of perfection, not a guarantee of anything beyond the present, but they were real, and that was enough. Olivia held his gaze, searching once more, not for certainty, but for sincerity, and what she found was something she had not allowed herself to expect, something steady, something willing, something that did not try to control what came next, but was ready to face it. She nodded slowly, not as a decision made in haste, but as one made with quiet understanding, because whatever came after this moment, whatever challenges or uncertainties waited beyond the room, she no longer felt like she had to face them alone. Alexander glanced once more at the baby, at Grace, the name now settled, real, part of something larger than either of them, and as he stood there, he understood something that had taken him years to learn, something no success or power had ever taught him, that the most important things in life were not the ones you planned, but the ones that changed you when you least expected it. The room remained quiet, the light steady, and in that stillness, nothing felt rushed, nothing felt unfinished, because for the first time, they were not trying to control the outcome, they were simply choosing to stay, to show up, to move forward one moment at a time, and sometimes, that was enough to begin again.